Journalism Week, and I guarantee this next session will probably be more useful to you than anything else this week when it comes to trying to get a placement or trying to get a job. Because I'm delighted to welcome to Journalism Week Vidar Hjardeng, who is the diversity consultant for ITV News and has been with ITV for more than 25 years. And diversity and awareness of diversity and the issues surrounding it is without doubt one of the hottest topics across the whole of the media industry at the moment. Only a couple of weeks ago, the broadcast regulator Ofcom published a guide on diversity, and every organisation is crucially aware of the importance of diversity, not simply because it's ticking boxes or earning brownie points, but if you're trying to broadcast to your audience, it helps if that audience is reflected with the same diversity as society, rather than being a specific area of that society. And that's what diversity is all about. And when it comes to trying to get a placement or trying to get a job, you will find that an employer will expect you to have an understanding of the issues and the awareness around diversity. So listen, learn, and welcome to Vidar.
Thank you very much indeed, Mike. No pressure then, the most useful thing this week. Hey, I hope I can live up to that billing. Thank you, Mike, for inviting me. Thanks to all of you for turning out in such great numbers. First of all, can I just check that everybody can hear me okay, yeah? That's always a good start. I've decided, I was saying to Mike, that I've decided I'm going to remain seated to actually make this a bit more conversational. If I stand at the lectern, it looks as if I might be giving something like the Gettysburg Address or something. So let's try and make it a little bit more relaxed. And depending on how the session goes over the next hour or so, we might make it a little bit more interactive with comments, reflections, questions from you guys, if there's anything you perhaps want to pick up on based on what I'm going to talk to you about during our time together. Couple of house rules, if I may. Just for those of you who aren't aware, and there's no big deal about it, but just in case anyone puts their hand up and I don't notice it, I happen to be visually impaired. What I always say to any audience is, if your eyes glaze over and you yawn and you think, God, he's dull and he's uninteresting, I shall be blissfully unaware. I do hear the snoring, though, so that's the giveaway, all right? If we do move into a more interactive, more discursive, conversational two-way, then Mike has very kindly been volunteered, stroke conscripted to be a sort of David Dimbleby type figure to field questions. What is diversity? Well, Mike actually has very nicely partly done my job for me in that sentence or two, because in a way he's summed it up very neatly in terms of what diversity is. What I hope we can do over the next 60 minutes or so is dispel any myths or any stereotypes or any sort of feelings of, ooh, it's worthy, it's tokenism, it's brownie points, it's, as Mike was saying, ticking the boxes. I think perhaps in the past that has been a view held, not by everyone obviously, but by some. And I'd like to show and demonstrate with you in the session we've got together that actually diversity, yes, it's important and it should be included and embedded in what you do professionally in all walks of life, actually, not just the media. But actually, I would suggest it makes the job of a journalist or of anyone working in that sort of world more interesting, more fulfilling. And it's just another, if you like, to use the analogy, weapon in the armory for that. So diversity is one of those words that for me sort of has morphed out of perhaps equality, which was the first buzzword in this sort of field. Equality increasingly became sort of diversity, and often these days people talk about inclusion. Quite like the word inclusion, because in a sense that for me is what it is all about. It is about being included and about being inclusive, and so inclusion isn't a bad sort of label to put on the side of the tin to try and sum up what this general area, this general theme is all about. Every one of you, everyone on this, in this university, in the society in which we live, has views, have opinions, have thoughts about a whole range of issues that are of relevance to your lives, are of interest to your lives, that make a difference to you, your families, your friends, etc. And actually, that's what diversity is. It's about treating those views with respect, making sure that those views are represented as far as is possible in a cross range of features, reports, trying to actually reflect back to people in a journalistic sense the stories that matter to them as individuals, their communities, their regions, their countries, what have you. Very briefly, just let me explain my remit before I develop some of those themes more specifically. My background is in journalism. I used to run the political and some of the social action current affairs programs for what was then Central Television, part of ITV, obviously in the Midlands. It is now one company, ITV, as I'm sure you're all aware, but still maintains the ITV franchises, the regional franchises, when it comes to news output. So clearly, I'm sure you will all be familiar with, and at least it allows me to get the free plug-in, Calendar down the road at Kirkstall Road, produced by my colleagues at ITV Yorkshire, and that's the local news programme, and that's replicated in the different regions like Central, Granada, Tyne Tees, etc., etc. My role currently is to lead on diversity, working with my colleagues across all the English regions and Wales and the Channel Islands. And people often ask, where do I live? And I often think I live at New Street Station because I seem to spend my life travelling to one or other part of the country. And if any politician ever offers me rail miles, well, who knows, I might vote for him or her, because that would be a good ruse. So lots of travelling involved. Really, really interesting, though, working with colleagues in the different regions, because as you will be aware, each of those regions is very different. Not just in terms of its population and its demography, but also in terms of its geography. And I would say that geographical diversity is part of the mix, as well as diversity relating to the makeup of the population, etc. I often think there are two broad areas where we need to look at diversity within broadcasting, within print journalism. And I know some of you here today are doing journalism courses, some in broadcast, some in print, some no doubt in digital. What I would say is that I'd like to think that the themes that we'll share today will be relevant to all of you, and frankly to other similar related courses as well. So it's not just, although my background is ostensibly in broadcast journalism, it isn't just hopefully relevant to that particular area, it's relevant to journalism per se. And what I would like to talk about is the two areas that I think it genuinely affects. So there's what I call in television terms, the on-screen content, or if it's in newspapers, the written content or online content, wherever you're accessing your news. It's the editorial content, basically. And then it's not just what is produced editorially, but how it's produced, the makeup of the workforce, who's actually producing it, making the decisions, reporting, producing, sub-editing, whatever the role happens to be. And for me, there's a symbiosis, there's a two-way process. The two areas are specifically linked. Underpinning diversity as a concept, there seem to me to be three fairly broad, important tenets. So first and foremost, I'd like to think that all of us in here automatically are morally or are signed up to the moral case for diversity. We all want to be included, we all want to be treated respectfully, we all want to be, taken seriously, etc., etc. So I'd like to think that's a given. In terms of the product that all of us will produce, hopefully in whatever career journalistically we go on to follow, the editorial content is hugely important, and that links into what I was saying a moment ago about, editorial diversity. And then there is also what I call the business case. And that goes for any organization, in my view, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector or the third so-called voluntary charitable sector. There's a real, I think, need, requirement, urgency for any organization to engage with as wide a range of people as possible, whether in terms of readers, listeners, viewers, or whatever, customers, if you want to call them that. That's the way forward, arguably, for any organization worth its salt. So those, if you like, are three sort of key tenets. There's also another theme I'd like to introduce with you, and I might come back to this a little bit later. What I call incidental diversity. So, what do I mean by that? Well, if you think of perhaps diversity in its broadest sense, There might have been a trend, and I'm not saying it was wrong, but there may have been a tendency to perhaps produce items in the past around Christmas, Diwali, Eid, some of the religious festivals. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Editorially, if that's a good story for a particular program, newspaper, online outlet, wherever it happens to be shown or produced, great. And you weigh up your editorial content at morning meetings and in other planning sessions before you actually decide what the final mix of product editorially is going to be. I'm all for that continuing, and by all means, if that's the right story on a given day, go for it. But what I want to ensure is that everybody remembers that just because you happen to talk to a number of people from the, say, Diwali, from the Hindu community about Diwali, or whoever it might be, you might talk to wheelchair users about a story around access to a building. That's important to them, sure. But they have just as many views about what Theresa May has said about globalization and its effect on people generally, or whether Gareth Southgate would be a good England football manager. Whatever the national, local, international stories are of the day that people are talking about at home, in the pub, in the office, by the water cooler, wherever they happen to be, then that is actually what diversity really means for me. It's involving everybody in as much as possible, if that's what they want to be involved in. So actually, the fact that they have a cultural background of some kind, perhaps they have a disability, perhaps they're of a particular age group, that in a way is incidental to why they are being included in any piece. That's incidental to why they're being featured in a story. They're first and foremost there because they've got something worth contributing, they've got something worth saying, they're a good interviewee, they've got a good story to tell. So it's worth just bearing in mind that by all means, look at specific stories that might arguably be more relevant to specific groups than others, although hopefully any story, even of that kind, would be relevant to your widest possible listenership, viewership, readership, whatever. But also just be mindful of the fact that actually, like all of you here, everybody out there has a view on most issues and would like to actually have that view reflected. When people are reading newspapers, listening to the radio, watching TV, accessing their news, their current affairs, however they do it, whenever they do it, and remember the customer, the viewer, the listener, the reader, at the end of the day is all powerful because he or he has so much choice these days. That puts a lot of pressure, arguably, on those producing the output. So competition is key, and it's an ever more competitive world, as I don't need to remind you guys. That has its challenges, but it also, I suggest, has its opportunities as well. And if you're not engaging with people, then you'll find through official, statistics monitoring who's listening to what, who's watching what, who's buying whatever newspaper, whatever it happens to be, that actually, you're losing people. And so it's really, really important to ensure that you are engaging with them. And to do that as effectively as possible, one of the key things seems to me that must be done is that you have to actually produce material that, going back to the point that Mike started off in his introduction referring to, which I've hopefully developed, you must reflect back to people the stories that matter to them, the people they know, the communities in which they live, etc. They may not necessarily know the interviewees, the contributors, the people being featured in the output, but they can empathize with them because they perhaps are similar to the people that they know down the street, round the block, wherever in their city, in their county, and what have you. And I think that's very, very important. And when you're looking at how best to cover a story, sometimes news being what it is, it's about being reactive. Short of having Mystic Meg on your production team in your newsroom, you won't know what's going to be the big story later on today, next week, next month, or whenever. So to that extent, you are following events and responding to events, which is then more of a challenge in terms of ensuring that you have as diverse a range of contributors as possible. I'll come back to hopefully how we can deal with that in a moment. Where you can proactively have more direct influence is what we call the diary stories, the stories that come up every year for whatever reason. To take a couple of examples, we've got the autumn statement, which Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, will be delivering very shortly. That will have an effect on every one of us to a greater or lesser extent, and indeed everyone living in the UK to a greater or lesser extent. And it's a question of how to respond to that through the outlet publishing-wise that you have, whether it's local TV, whether it's radio, whether it's national newspapers or what have you. And you can do some planning around who might be a good contributor, where geographically you should send your crews, all that sort of thing. Worth planning in advance. So planning is really crucial, I would suggest, to trying to ensure that you're aiming and aspiring to successfully as diverse a range of content and contributor as humanly possible. The planning also actually, I would say, has a spin-off and a positive and a beneficial spin-off even when you're reacting to events and having to, if you like, follow up on events. Because if you've planned well and if you've developed your networks, your databases, your contact base, and fundamentally it's one of the age-old dimensions of journalism. It's all about who you know and who was prepared to talk to you, who have you got the trust of, all of that sort of thing. Networks, contacts, an absolute keystone, cornerstone of any journalist's career. If you've done your planning and if you're constantly developing that, building it up, working on it, sort of developing it, increasing it, enlarging it, that will help you be prepared for some of the events that you can't predict and that you have to respond to very rapidly, often at the 11th hour with the old deadlines to meet that I'm sure you're all well familiar with through some of the practical stuff you have to do here. And if you do move into the world of journalism, as I hope, if not all of you, most of you will, that you will certainly be facing that challenge and that professional goal day in, day out. So networks and contacts, really, really important. That maybe sounds obvious, and sometimes things are very obvious, but we get too close to them, and it's worth just stepping back and reminding ourselves of one or two of those, what I say now, maybe very obvious things. So always, whatever stage you're at, whether you've done 1 year or 31 years in a career in the media, in journalism in particular, just remember the importance of, networks and contacts. And it's all about building up people's trust. All of us are humans at the end of the day, and none of us is infallible, so we will all make mistakes. As long as you acknowledge that, if you have inadvertently made an error for whatever reason, you correct it, you take people with you, you show that you want to make amends, whatever it might be, you've looked at it in good faith. Obviously, people won't want to talk to you either off the record or indeed on camera or in front of a microphone or for a direct quote in a newspaper if they don't feel that they have your full trust, or particularly vice versa. So trust is a really, really important dimension to anyone's career working in the media, working in journalism. And, it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking, well, we've got some really good people who we can talk to on health-related stories or on the property market or whatever the issue of the day happens to be. And that's great. And you will always need those people who are very happy at very short notice to have somebody dash down with a camera to actually, give you 15 seconds for the program or whatever. But it's important to keep developing that. And again, that's where you can weave in your incidental diversity. So if you want to do a story on, childhood obesity or whatever it happens to be, the fact that a GP happens to be a woman, the fact that the GP you're interviewing happens to come from a particular cultural background is incidental to why he or she is being featured, being talked to. They're there because they've got something worth saying, they're an expert in their field, and they are representative of a community in which you're broadcasting, in which your publication is being sold or distributed or whatever it happens to be. And therefore, hopefully, they are relevant to and can be empathized with by those people who actually are listening to the material on the radio, watching it on the telly, reading it wherever they access it. So it's another way of trying to ensure that you're being as diverse and representative and relevant as possible. So all that is really, really important. I don't want to bore you with too much legalese today, but it's worth just highlighting one particular area of recent parliamentary legislation now in law, and you can do some more research and homework, if you like, as and when you have a moment. But some of you may have heard of the Equalities Act, which came into effect 2010, so coming up to, well, nearly 7 years ago now. And it was towards the end of the last Labour government's time in office. The then Equalities Minister, who was leading on equalities issues, Harriet Harman, took through Parliament the Equalities Act. And the aim of that basically was to strengthen anti-discrimination legislation. Hitherto, there'd been a lot of different pieces of legislation. I won't list them all because we'd be here all day if I did, but just to give you an example of a couple of them, the Equal Pay Act, the Race Relations Act, Disability Discrimination Act, to name but three. They were all, if you like, brought together under this one all-embracing act. And as I say, it was to strengthen anti-discrimination in what the legal jargon calls 9 protected characteristics. Some might call it diversity strands. Again, I'm not going to list them all here. You can find them out online if you want to do some work around the act or whatever. But to give you a flavor of some of those areas, age is one, disability is another, religion or faith is a third, marriage, civil partnership is a fourth, transgender, sexual orientation. So there's half a dozen straight away there. A couple of areas aren't covered by the Act. What in the old days may have been called class, or these days perhaps people refer to it more as social economic background, that's not covered. And size and weight isn't necessarily covered either by the legislation. But just worth throwing that in just to give you that perspective, I guess. But it's relevant not just to people working in journalism, the wider media, but it's actually relevant to the whole of society, this piece of legislation. And just worth flagging that up with you here today, just to give you that context, in a sense, to because again, that's relevant to the work that you're doing on the course, and hopefully will increasingly be doing when you go out into the big wide world and start earning your paychecks in the media in whatever capacity that happens to be. My background is, as you know, in broadcast journalism, so forgive me for maybe dwelling a little bit more on that field, because it's obviously, arguably, the area that perhaps I'm more familiar with. And again, a bit like not wanting to give you too much legalese, I don't want to give you too many acronyms here today, because there's nothing worse than sort of blinding people with statistics and or a whole range of letters standing for different things. But one group of letters that is worth sharing with you is CDN, and that stands for the Creative Diversity Network. And that is an organization that came out of a couple of previous organizations, the Cultural Diversity Network and the Broadcasting and Creative Industries Disability Network. That's now, as I say, come together through something called the Creative Diversity Network. And the mainstream broadcasters, so yes, ITV, but also the BBC and our other counterparts, channels 4 and 5, Sky, CNN, etc., etc., they are part of this group, and at senior level within the organizations, they meet formally and informally to look at what works, what's good practice around diversity, both in terms of on-screen content, on-screen portrayal, but also the makeup of the workforce. Because actually, although all the organizations are competitors in their own field, there's a recognition that one thing that they all have in common is that they want to get the best people in the industry for the jobs that are going, the internships that are on offer, the work placements that may be there. And obviously, again, they all want to try and ensure that their output, not just in news, I hasten to add, but this crosses all genres, so drama, sport, light entertainment, whatever it happens to be. They want to ensure that, again, people are engaging with that and actually actively want to switch on because they enjoy what they see. And so that's worth just knowing a little bit about. And, you know, again, you can find out more about the CDN and the work that it does on its website, and hopefully that will be helpful to you. Within ITV, we have a number of initiatives that hopefully help us to embed diversity into what we do, what we produce, how we operate in newsrooms, both nationally at ITN and regionally across the English regions, Wales. I mustn't call Wales only a region, it's definitely a country, and the Channel Islands. We have a diversity champion. In fact, we have more than one usually, at least 2 diversity champions in each newsroom. They are normally people who are senior within that newsroom, so presenters or senior reporters, correspondents, and they very much work with the head of news and myself, trying to sort of remind colleagues about the importance of bearing in mind diversity and related issues. And we have diversity advisory panels that meet in a formal way every 3 months or so. They're very much made up of people who first and foremost are interested in what's being produced news-wise. They've got an interest in watching news and current affairs. They're there also first and foremost as representatives of themselves, so they're individuals, but they have networks. They may well happen to have a lot of contacts in particular communities or in particular organizations relating to a particular issue or whatever it happens to be. And they're, if you like, very helpful, critical friends who can help us widen the discussion and actually take away from what some might regard as navel-gazing. Of course it's important to have discussions within the confines of your own peer group and your own professional world, in your own newsroom, in your own morning conference, or whatever it happens to be. That absolutely is very, very important. But it's also quite good to try and be a bit more sort of outward looking and, take views, take opinions from people who aren't necessarily working in news day in, day out. What I'd like to think helps to give a wider perspective, a more objective perspective, arguably, on occasions. And again, they can be helpful in terms of building up databases, going back to that all-important networking, that all-important sort of talking to people. Most news stories, current affairs issues stand or fall by case studies, as we call them, and you'll be familiar with that terminology, I'm sure, from the type of studying that you're doing. And people telling their story and the way they tell it and how they tell it and to whom they tell it is, old-fashioned journalism, but it's what I think makes or breaks the interest of your listener, your viewer, your reader. And getting as wide a range of contributors as possible is important. And again, they can help, panel members can help in that regard, formally or informally. They can also help in discussions around the use of language. Now, journalism, it's all about telling people's stories, but to do that, that involves vocabulary, terminology, all the rest of it. And as you will know, language, not just here in the UK, but I suggest it's probably true throughout the world, is forever evolving, forever changing. And what something may have meant a generation ago may not necessarily be the case today. And there are times when people are concerned that perhaps they're not getting the right phrase, they're not necessarily hitting the right note in terms of being sensitive or objective or whatever else it is. And my advice on that is to ask, if in doubt, ask, refer it up, talk to people informally when you're getting a cup of coffee in the newsroom, raise it at a production meeting more formally. The chances are, if you're unsure, you won't be the only one in that team that is. And there often isn't an absolute right or wrong. A lot is contextually based, so it's all a matter of context. A lot is nuanced. But if you discuss it, if you raise it, and you come to a consensus within your newsroom in terms of how style or how to approach a given story or a given situation, that hopefully, first and foremost, gives everyone the confidence to be comfortable to take that forward. And it means that, people are sharing, their thoughts, their reflections, and their own anxiety, perhaps, maybe that's a bit strong, but their own sort of nervousness about what language or terminology to use. I'm not overly prescriptive about what you mustn't do and what's an absolute no or an absolute yes. As I say, that would be too glib, I think, to say that. I will just share one or two thoughts with you, though, in this area, just to try and emphasize the type of approach I'm meaning. If somebody happens to have, let's say, a long-term health condition or a disability. In my view, as reporters, as journalists, as writers, we should simply refer to the fact that so-and-so has epilepsy, so-and-so is visually impaired, whatever the situation happens to be. If he or she happens to say in a direct quote as part of the feature or in the article or wherever it happens to be appearing, that they have suffered from epilepsy or visual impairment for 20-odd years or whatever it happens to be, clearly that's their prerogative, that's how they see it. And if that's how they want to, convey their view, absolutely right, as an interviewee should. But we're very much there as the link between that interviewee, that contributor, and those watching the output, reading the output, listening to the output. And we've got the privilege of being that link, that conduit. And it is our job, in my view, this sounds rather old-fashioned, but I really feel this quite strongly, to report and to present the situation objectively, fairly, impartially, and basically not to be emotive. So it's just often use of simple words. Has, is, often goes a long way just to telling the story. Remember as well, it almost sounds obvious to say it as I'm about to do, but nonetheless worth reminding ourselves, if you're operating in television, not only do you have words and language, but you have pictures, and pictures can tell us the story and actually can help you in terms of actually, not needing to say too much in terms of voiceover or script, because the pictures are very telling in their own right. And it's another tool that you've got as part of your storytelling process. Again, if you're dealing with, we've recently had, as you will all know, the Olympics and the Paralympics in Rio. If you're talking to Paralympian athletes, remember, first and foremost, you're talking to them because they're elite athletes. Yes, their disability, their condition is part of their story as to why they're in the Paralympics, but they're there first and foremost because they're brilliant at what they do in a sporting and an athletic context. And that's where you start from. And it's a bit of a tightrope sometimes, perhaps, to weave in somebody's story in terms of how they got there and what effect any given condition or disability has had on their lives. But again, remember that they are there to be applauded for, to be celebrated for their achievement as athletes on behalf of their country, etc. And, if in doubt, again, talk to the people you're interviewing, share it with colleagues. Don't try and push it under the carpet or think, well, I'll work around it in a different sort of way. It's always best to try, if in doubt, talk. I often make the analogy, actually, to if somebody sadly has undergone a bereavement. All of us, I'm sure, have been in this situation, sadly, and very often we all think, I must drop so-and-so a card or send them a note or say how sorry I am. And then, we're all busy, all got hectic lives, 24 hours a day aren't necessarily enough sometimes. And occasionally you suddenly find, oh, I didn't get that note written, it's a week later, then it's a month later, and then you see them walking down the street or coming into the office and you think, oh God, I didn't talk to them, I didn't say anything, didn't acknowledge it. And it becomes an issue and you try and avoid eye contact and things. It builds up and it's probably, difficult for them and for you. And in a way, the more you put off discussions around diversity, the use of language, et cetera, arguably the same thing could happen. So raise the questions. There aren't always absolute right or wrong answers. And as I say, by sharing it, that will hopefully help you all come to a comfortable place. I talked about the symbiotic relationship between what we produce and how it's produced. And if I can turn briefly to the how it's produced, in other words, the makeup of the workforce, who's actually putting the programs, whether it's broadcast journalism or the newspapers or the online material together. And again, that in an ideal world, that workforce should be as reflective as possible of the region, the county, the city, the country in which that material is being produced and for whom that material is being produced. 2016 Britain is very different to 2006 Britain and and you know, arguably, you know, society is changing by the month, by the year. You will perhaps be familiar with the fact that hitherto, every 10 years, there has been what we call the census produced, giving, if you like, a very detailed picture of the makeup of Britain. It's a portrait of the population makeup of the United Kingdom of Britain. And again, that has some really, really interesting material in it, nationally, regionally, etc. Again, sounds like telling you how to suck eggs, but if and when you move into a particular role professionally, if you're new to that area, and actually even if you're not, make sure that you feel comfortable with knowing your patch. What is the population makeup? You know, is there an older age range perhaps? Is it a more rural community? Whatever it happens to be. The more you do that, the more you will immediately be respected by those who are actually taking in your material in whatever form. They will think you've got a genuine interest in and knowledge of the area you're covering. And again, actually, it makes your job as journalists, as reporters, as producers, that much more interesting. So just do some homework, find out about, you know, what the big issues are in that region, find out about who some of the key contributors to particular debates might be, but also try and ensure that you find some of your own contributors who ultimately might take on some of those key contributor roles, going back to that networking, that contact database sort of approach. And to try and ensure that the links with the community as a whole can be as strong as possible. In an ideal world, any workforce will hopefully be increasingly relevant and reflective of that community. That takes time. Inevitably, there aren't vacancies coming up for either jobs at all levels or internships or placements, whatever it happens to be, every day of the week. And so inevitably, that cultural change, if I can call it that, isn't going to happen overnight. It's arguably a little bit like turning round a tanker. But it's an important thing to keep very, very much everyone's eyes focused on, because without doing that, you're going to fall further and further behind, you know, the aspiration to be relevant to, representative of the area in which you're operating. I guess it's important to say that ultimately you want the best person for the job, the internship, the placement in question. And you should, and rightly so, go through an open, transparent recruitment process. And therefore, for me, actually, to try and ensure that you can stand up and say, hand on heart, we think we have got the best person for the role in question, your initial talent pool from where you're selecting your original crop of applications is hugely important. So actually, although it might make the job of recruiters and assessors tougher, because there's more material to go through at that initial stage, by having as large and as diverse a range of initial applications as possible gives you a much stronger starting point on which to start developing and making the decisions around who to go through to the next round, who to go through to the assessment, who to be shortlisted for the interview, etc. People will only, in my view, want to apply for a given job or attachment or secondment or internship or whatever it's on offer if he or she feels that the organization is relevant to them, if they feel they could make a difference, if they could add something to the work of that organization in the job, in the role being offered. And again, by sort of feeling one way or another on that score, they're going to be influenced by what they've seen being produced hitherto by that output, and that's why I think the two are so closely linked in terms of the content produced and how it's produced. So be mindful of the fact that actually people thinking about a career in journalism will be looking at what's being produced, and if they feel that's not really a place I would feel comfortable because what I've seen on screen, what I've heard on the radio, what I've read in the press, then that, in a sense, starts to immediately mean that you actually won't get as rich a diversity of initial applications as ideally you would want. And that's a challenge facing not just people in the media or in journalism across the board, but the wider society as we live in. Because, you know, again, any organization, whether it's, you know, looking for a head teacher in education or a hospital administrator or whatever, frankly, in the health service, everyone wants to arguably get the best person, rightly so, for the job in question. And as I say, that's very much, you know, a challenge facing everybody. We've moved a long way, I think it's fair to say, in my time. And I'm not, we've got a huge way to go, and we always will have, because society is forever evolving. And the day you think you've cracked any of this and sorted it is the day to go off and do something else. But just to give you a couple of practical examples of how I think we have made progress in that field, at the risk of sounding 110, having been in this industry for the best part of 30 years since I did a postgrad journalism course in London, when I first started as a researcher with ITV at Birmingham in the Midlands, there were, to the best of my knowledge, no women in heads of news positions at any level, nationally or regionally. Fast forward 3 decades, and we currently have, out of 11 heads of news across the regions and Wales, we have 7 who happen to be women. They're not there because we've ticked the right boxes. They're there because, first and foremost, they're really, really good at what they do. They're there on merit. But the culture has changed to make sure that we are encouraging, that we have attracted people to actually want to put their hat into the ring and go for those positions. And that, I think, is the sort of demonstrable change that only you can, you know, demonstrate over time. As I say, just because we've got that particular figure at the moment doesn't mean, hey, it's all sorted, it's all done. It's not. And, you know, if you think of Britain as it is today and the different regions of countries that make up Britain and how they are, then that's actually really, really important to try and be mindful of that in your recruitment in the same way as your editorial content. I talked a bit about geographical diversity. I've talked a lot about demography. I've talked a lot about the makeup of the population. But it's worth just saying that for me, geographical diversity is hugely important. And by that, what I mean, and it's probably obvious, but just to spell it out, if you live in Devon and Cornwall, the stories that probably are going to be relevant to you are arguably very different to whether you live in Leicester or Manchester. And again, going back to my earlier point about getting to know your patch, getting to know what's of interest to people, getting to know the stories that they feel bothered about, that they want to discuss, that they want to tune in and hear more about, that's actually hugely important. And regionality actually is fascinating, and it makes the job more interesting as well. So you'll have in some regions agriculture as a much, much more hot topic than perhaps in others. Others issues, education, health, law and order, all sorts of things like that will be pretty much across all regions to a greater or lesser extent. But there are some areas that will feature some issues more than others. And again, I don't want to sound patronizing and say, remember that, but it's worth just taking all of that into consideration, because that's hugely, hugely important. Again, you don't have to be a walking encyclopedia on every fact and figure that's produced by the Office of National Statistics or the Office of Population Census. But again, it's worth just getting an idea of, you know, what the percentage of the population is that might happen to have a particular faith, or what the percentage is in your region, et cetera, et cetera. And again, it just helps you sort of think about how you're going to tackle stories, how you're going to approach people, how you're going to talk to people. And in that sort of getting to know your patch, going back to develop your contacts, it's getting people engaged with you, getting people to trust you. Often people talk about harder to reach communities. I would also describe them as perhaps more easily to overlook communities. And at the end of the day, communities are only ever made up of individuals. I happen to be visually impaired. There are 2 million people with sight loss in and around the United Kingdom. We don't all have the same views on every single issue in the same way as people from a particular faith background don't, or a particular cultural background don't. So try not to put people into boxes or stereotype them as well. That's another thing that's easily done with the best will in the world and in good faith, but it's a lazy trait, and it's something that is worth guarding against. So you've got diversity in all its forms, both in terms of what's produced content-wise, how it's produced in terms of the makeup of the workforce, and various initiatives that all sorts of organizations have to try and ensure that as wide a range of initial applications come in as possible are being sort of carried out. Just by way of an example, ITV News this month is going to be doing something that it's done under the auspices of that CDN umbrella, remember, the Creative Diversity Network that I talked about earlier on. We've got an annual event that actually is also carried out in many other newsrooms for the BBC and others, Sky, etc., called Open Newsrooms Day. And the idea behind that is that in a small way, because clearly the numbers aren't going to be thousands, but we try and encourage people who normally are at school age, thinking about, you know, what to do A-level-wise, career-wise, etc., but who actually have an interest in news, but feel for whatever reason that actually, much as I'd love to do that, I don't think I've got a hope of getting a job at X or Y or Z. And we want to try and break down some of those myths and stereotypes around the industry as a whole. We want to ensure that we're trying to appeal to everyone. So if you've got a keenness, a willingness, an interest in working in TV news, then from whatever background, whether or not you have a disability, etc., that's irrelevant. All of that actually can add something to your application. It makes you who you are. And we want to encourage people to think about seriously applying for and maybe taking up an opportunity if it comes their way in that role. And by shadowing people in the newsroom, not just editorially, because it's important to remember that whatever output you have, whether it's print, broadcast, online, etc., there are editorial roles, there are management roles editorially, but there are also production specialist roles for people who work on as camera operators or directors or in administrative capacities too. They're all hugely important. And ultimately, producing news, producing current affairs, producing that type of material is a team effort, and each role is hugely important to the working of that, you know, organization or that newsroom. So in a small way, we can hopefully inspire, encourage people. I guess we may well put one or two people off completely if it's not what they actually thought it would be. So they're not, you know, wasting their time as they might see it. I hope, though, seriously, that anyone who has any sort of lingering doubt that it's not for them would go away at the end of that day thinking, wow, actually that is something I'd like to give a go to and follow it through. And the same is true at all levels, really. And unless you're appealing to as many people as possible to give it a go, to dip their toe in the water, to apply, to see whether they can make a difference, whether they can add to that, you know, output in terms of being part of the team, then that's really, really important. Mike, I think I've got away with it so far. I haven't heard any snoring. You may well be telling me that there's lots of yawning or eyes glazing over, but I don't know how we're doing for time. Or
15 minutes to go.
15 minutes to go.
Yeah, and everyone's wide awake.
Okay, good. Well, I've rattled on for about 45 minutes. We've got about 10, 15 minutes, as Mike has said. Shall we open it up a bit and see if anyone... Now, this is where I always say, has anyone got anything they want to ask or comment on or disagree with or whatever? And most people then look at the floor or the ceiling because no one wants to go first. But see who's going to be brave and put their head above the parapet.
We have someone in front row.
Excellent. Say who you are, perhaps, please, as well.
I'm Sam, I'm doing the MA journalism here.
Hi.
Do you think maybe some media networks, they tried too hard to be diverse?
This is an age-old debating point, isn't it? If you don't try, you're damned, and if you're seen by some to try too hard, you're condemned for that as well. And remember, everybody has his or her own definition as to whether it's trying too hard or whether it's doing too little. You know, if you go to the point of actually, you know, doing people the disservice of, how do I put this more tactfully? If you're doing it fairly, objectively, and for the right reasons and pragmatically, that's what will count. If you do end up, for whatever reason, and however you interpret it, as perhaps doing it too far, then ultimately that will be counterproductive for all sorts of reasons. I think the key thing for me is that after a generation or so in the industry, to see how much people have come forward in their thinking around diversity, not just in this industry, but also in the wider society, professional worlds in which we all live. I shouldn't make this sort of general assumption, but I will for the sake of argument. You guys, your generation, gets this far more than perhaps my generation at your age would have done. And I think that tells its own story. You know, you guys will talk to each other, in my experience, from talking to people and having, you know, nieces, nephews, godchildren, all the rest of it, that sort of age. They are much more open about things like mental health issues, that type of thing, that perhaps society hasn't been as comfortable with dealing with as perhaps it ought to have been. And I think that's only but a good thing, because actually that will translate into people getting older and those issues becoming less of a sort of taboo issue. There's a lot more to be done around mental health and that type of issue, but at least government are recognizing that. Even if you look at sort of the makeup of our establishment, organizations like Parliament, there's been a lot of debate in the last decade and 20 years. How do you get more women into Parliament? How do you get more people from ethnic minorities into Parliament? The debates go on in all sorts of professional ways, and actually the fact that that has happened over the past generation is to be welcomed. If occasionally some might have felt it's gone too far, well, that's maybe the price that you pay for at least people addressing it seriously. But I'd like to think that people are more or less getting the right balance. But thanks for the question.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
Isn't the entire concept of diversity like, since it espouses equality of outcome and equality of opportunity?
Equality of opportunity in a way is where you start from with all these, or should start from with all these things. Ultimately, you want to ensure that if it's somebody wanting to apply for a job in telly, radio, newspapers, digital platforms, whatever it is, that they should feel A, that they should, and B, that they have just as much opportunity to get that job as anybody else, any of their competitors, regardless of culture, creed, background, and everything else. And once they're in, if they're good, then hopefully they will demonstrably prove that they've got talents and abilities like all of us have. And it's a question actually of being honest about your talents, your abilities. I'm often asked the question, should I declare I have a disability? My view is ultimately yes, but there are ways of doing it. You don't have to write it in your first sentence on an application. But that disability makes you the person you are. People's lifestyle in all sorts of ways, people's protected characteristics influence their education, their lives, their professional outlook, all sorts of things. So I'd like to think if you've got a rich, group of people, I don't mean rich in financial terms, I'm talking about in terms of having lots of talent, lots of skills, lots of expertise in their own different ways, then that's hugely important. As long as those people genuinely feel they have equality of opportunity, that is what it really should be about. And then hopefully that will feed through to the industry as a whole, making it a genuinely more diverse place, not just to tick the boxes and things that we started by talking about at the beginning.
Interesting question. Yeah.
You mentioned geographical diversity. With that, do you think that some media outlets are guilty of being too London-centric? And do you think that's perhaps why we got the Brexit vote wrong?
There's always danger that perhaps, and this may be true, and I've no specific analysis of data to say it is, but the chances are any country's capital is often where people start to look at what views are, what opinions are, etc., and occasionally it may be that there is a disconnect between that capital and other parts of the country. The beauty of the regional outlets that we have in TV terms, whether it's BBC or ITV or newspapers or radio or community stations and all of that, hopefully means that those people, wherever they live, whoever they are, can actually have a view, can actually be heard, etc. There's often a discussion, particularly around political debates and things, as to whether Westminster is genuinely in touch with people in the constituencies across the country, and that debate will no doubt always go on, and it's an important one for the media to be focused on. And if you are doing a feature on a particular issue, it's important that in regional terms you don't always stick to Birmingham or to Manchester just because it's easy. sometimes resources dictate where you go, but make sure you do get out to Shropshire or you get up to Lancashire or whatever it happens to be, because again, that makes people feel, if I would suggest that subliminally, if somebody hears that our reporter's been up to Southport or our reporter's been out to Hereford to hear from people there, that chimes with people, and that's again why they might think, oh, this is relevant to me after all. So there is always a danger that the capital takes on a disproportionate sort of content base, but you know, that's why I think it's important that geographical diversity is really taken seriously. Thank you.
Okay, any more? Yeah.
Do you think American journalism takes into account like diversity as much as we do? Can you see like a clear difference at all, or people are really passionate?
It's a good question, and I'm actually going to duck it because I don't know enough about American journalism, if I'm honest. So I'm not going to give you a political answer. I could waffle and say that's a really interesting question, which it is. And actually, do you know, it's one that I go away and think about. Because one of the beauties for me of doing this type of session is that you always get asked things that you perhaps haven't thought about as much as you should have done, or things that you hadn't even thought about. That's a really interesting point, and sorry not to give you an answer now, but I will take it away because it's a good point and very topical in the light of what happened in the States last week, of course. Thank you.
Okay, any more? Just picking up on one point that you made, Vidar, if there wasn't the Cultural Diversity Network, if there wasn't the Ofcom guide being published about diversity, do you think the industry would take it seriously? Or is that pressure required to actually make them acknowledge the importance of diversity?
I think I genuinely say, Mike, that yeah, of course that adds another dimension to a more formal regulatory system in which we all operate. But I genuinely think, because of the world in which we live, if people aren't viewing, listening, watching in the numbers that arguably any organisation would like them to be, they're going to ask why. And it's, you know, and if people, and a lot of it will come back to whether or not people feel that an organisation engages with them, the people they know, the stories that matter to them. So there's a real imperative, not just morally and editorially, as I said, but actually from a business case, if you like, to get out and make sure that we're inclusive and reflective and representative as possible. So yeah, it adds to the mix, but I would say that compared to a generation ago, things have moved immeasurably in the right direction. But the message I want to leave here today with is that there's plenty more to do, and you guys will hopefully have a role in being part of that going forward.
Okay, any final questions? Okay, huge amount of food for thought there, and I hope you will begin to digest some of those points over the coming weeks and months, and you will think about those issues when you're thinking about creating a film, whether it's here at the university or whether you're working in the industry. Journalism Week continues at 2 o'clock with Rachel Bartlett, but for now, please thank Vidar.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thanks very much, Mike. And can I just say thank you guys for coming, and hopefully it won't be that many years before some of you are sat in this chair doing the type of thing I've been doing today. Good luck with your course. Thank you.